I've also liked your phrase about the anti-moral act being one that is that contradicts the self-realization of the individual. And it seems to me both of us are trying to push beyond some of the trends that are very prominent in the modern world, the logical positivistic, the ultra-scientific approach, the stress a mechanistic and highly deterministic point of view, which as I see it makes man just an object, and trying to find some alternative stance in relation to life. I wonder if you feel we're in some agreement on issues of that sort.
Yes, of course. In all these points I heartily agree, and I'm very glad that you enumerate them for me.
Well, and perhaps we could push into some areas where I'm not quite so sure. I wonder what some of your views are about the nature of man. When I've been asked about that, I think some of the existentialists take the point of view that man really has no nature, but it seems to me that he has. I've taken the point of view that man belongs to a particular species. He has species characteristics. One of those, I think, being the fact that he has I think he's incurably social. I think he has a deep need for relationships. Then I think simply because man is an organism, he tends to be directional. He's moving in the direction of actualizing himself. For myself, I really feel man does have a describable nature. I've been interested, for example, in the fact that you discuss the demonic aspects of man. I don't know whether you see that as a part of his nature. At any rate, I'd be interested in your views in regard to the nature of man.
Now, your question is very far-reaching and demands of me a little bit longer answer. The first point I want to make is that man definitively has a nature. And I think the best way to prove this is negatively, by showing how impossible it is if somebody denies that man has a nature. I think of the famous French existentialist Sartre, who has denied that man has a nature and has emphasized that man is everything he makes of himself, and this is his freedom. But if he says that this is man's freedom to make himself, then this of course means he has a nature of freedom, which other species do not have. So to make such statements is somehow self-contradictory. Even if you attribute to men what medieval theology attributed to God, namely to be by himself and not conditioned by anything else, even then you cannot escape the statement that man has a nature. Now that's my answer to the first element in your question, but there are two more, and I want to get at them. The second is that I distinguish, so to speak, two natures of man, or one which one rightly calls his nature and the other which is a mixture of accepting and distorting his true nature. The first one I would call, with a very vague term, his true nature, but to make it less vague, I usually call it his essential nature. And if I speak theologically, then I call it man's created nature. And you remember that this is one of the main points about which the early church was tremendously fighting, namely that man's essential or created nature is good. According to the biblical word, God looked at everything he has created, and behold, it was very good. And there is an even more philosophically formulated affirmation of this by Augustine, namely esse qua esse bonum est, which means in English, being as being is good. Now that is what I would call man's essential nature. And then from this we must distinguish man's existential nature, of which I would say it has the characteristic of being estranged from his true nature. Man as he is in time and space, in biography and history. And this man is not simply the opposite of man's essential nature, then it wouldn't be man any longer. But it's a distortion of it. And an attempt to reach it, or a contradict to reach the true nature, or contradicting the true nature, it is a tremendous mixture. And in order to understand the real human predicament, we must distinguish these two elements. I believe that in Freud himself and much Freudianism and generally psychotherapy, there's no clear distinction of these 2 points. Now this was your second element. Now shall I answer also your third element, or perhaps...
Well, let me make one comment on this. I find in my work as a therapist that if I can create a climate of the utmost of freedom for the other individual, that I can really trust the directions that he will move. That is, people sometimes say to me, well, if you create a climate of freedom, a man might use that freedom to become completely evil or antisocial. I don't find that to be true, and this is one of the things that makes me feel that I don't know whether this is essentially or existentially, but that in a relationship of real freedom, the individual tends to move toward not only deeper self-understanding, but toward more social behavior.
Yes, now I would put a question mark to this. And I would say that first of all, who is free enough to create this situation of freedom for the others? And since I call this mixture of man's essential nature and his estranged nature ambiguous, the realm of the ambiguity of life, I would say under the condition of this ambiguity, nobody is able to create this sphere of freedom. But now let's suppose that it exists in some other way. I can come to this later when we speak about the demonic. Then I still would say the individual who lives in such a social group in which freedom is given to him remains an ambiguous mixture between essential and existential being. He is, as the English language expresses it beautifully, in a predicament. And this predicament is universal, tragic estrangement from one's true being. Therefore, I don't believe in the power of the individual to use his freedom in the way in which he should, namely fulfilling one's own essential potentialities or essentialities. These 2 words are here the same. So I am more skeptical both about the creation of such a situation and about the individuals who are in such a situation.
I would agree on the difficulty of creating complete freedom. I'm sure none of us are ever able to really create that for another person in its completeness. Yet what impresses me is that even imperfect attempts to create a climate of freedom and acceptance and understanding seem to liberate the person to move toward really social goals. I wonder if it is your thinking about the demonic aspect that makes you put a question mark after that.
Now let me first answer you what you just said. And here I would very much agree. I would say there are fragmentary actualizations in history. And I agree especially with the deep insight we have gained largely by psychotherapy about the tremendous importance of love in earliest ages of the development of children. So the question would come here, where are the forces which create a situation in which the child receives that love which gives him later on the freedom to face life and not to escape from life into neurosis and psychosis. And I leave that question open. But now you are interested about the demonic. And you are not the only one. I myself was, and everybody is in some way. So let me say how I came to this concept. I wrote in the year 1926, when I still was professor at the University of Dresden in Germany, a little article, little pamphlet, The Demonic. And the reason not to speak of the fallen man or the sinful man or any of these phrases was that I saw from 2 points of view structures which are stronger than the goodwill of the individual. And one of these structures was the neurotic psychotic structure. I came into contact after the First World War, since 1920 about, with the psychoanalytic movement coming from Freud at that time and changing the climate of the whole century already in Europe at that time. And the second was the analysis of the conflicts of society by the socialist movement and especially by the early writings of Karl Marx. And in both cases, I found a phenomenon for which these traditional terms like fallen men and sinful men are not sufficient. The only sufficient term I found in the New Testament use of the term demonic, which is in the stories about Jesus similar to being possessed. That means being in a force, under a force which is stronger than the individual goodwill. And so I use that term, of course. I emphasize very much, I don't mean it in a mythological sense, as little demons or a personal Satan running around the world, but I mean it as structures which are ambiguous, both to a certain extent creative, but ultimately destructive. And this is the reason why I introduced that term. So instead of only speaking of estranged mankind and not using the old terminology anyhow, I had to find a term which covers the transpersonal power which takes hold of a man and of society, of a man in stages, let's say, of drunkenness, being a drunkard, and not being able to overcome it, or producing a society in which either class conflicts or, as today in the whole world, conflicts of great ideologies, of great forms of political faith struggle with each other, and every step to overcome them has usually the consequence to drive the people more deeply into them. Now this is what I meant with the demonic. So I hope I made one thing clear, that I don't mean it in old mythological sense, which of course has to be demythologized.
And certainly when I look at some of the things going on in the world from the power point of view and so on, I can see why you might think in terms of demonic structures. I'd like to talk a little bit about the way I see this matter of alienation and estrangement. It seems to me that the infant is not estranged from himself. To me it seems that the infant is a whole and integrated organism, gradually individual. And that the estrangement that occurs is one that he learns, that in order to preserve the love of others, parents usually, he takes into himself as something he has experienced for himself the judgments of his parents, just like the small boy who's been rebuked for pulling his sister's hair goes around saying, bad boy, and meanwhile he's pulling her hair again. In other words, he's introjected the notion that he's bad, where actually he's enjoying the experience. And it's this estrangement between what he is experiencing and the concepts he links up with what he's experiencing that seems to me to constitute the basic estrangement. I don't really want to comment on that because I also want to get into the kind of thing that heals it, the relationship, but perhaps you...
Yes, of course the infant is a very important problem. I call in more philosophical or better psychological terms the mythological state of Adam and Eve before the fall, sleeping, dreaming innocence. It has not yet reached reality. It is still dreaming. Of course, this also is a symbol. But it's a symbol which is nearer to our psychological language than the fall of Adam and Eve. But it means the same thing, and it means that Adam, namely man, Hebrew Adam means man, that man, every man, is in a process of transition from dreaming innocence to conscious self-actualization. And in this process, the estrangement also takes place, as well as the fulfillment, therefore my concept of ambiguity. And I agree with you that there is also in what the parents used to call bad boy or bad girl, there is also a necessary act of self-fulfillment. But there is also something asocial in it, because it hurts his sister. And so it has to be repressed, and whether we say bad boy or prevents it in any other way. This is equally necessary. And these experiences mean for me the slow process of transition from dreaming innocence into self-actualization on the one side and self-estrangement on the other side. And these two acts are ambiguously intermixed. So that would be about my interpretation of the situation of the infants.
Well, there's much in that I would agree with. I'd like to say a little bit about the kind of relationship in which I think man's estrangement can be healed, as I see it from my own experience. For example, when we talk about, when either of us talk about the courage to be or the tendency to become oneself, I feel that perhaps that can only be fully achieved in a relationship. Perhaps the best example of what I'm talking about is that I believe that the person can only accept the unacceptable in himself when he is in a close relationship in which he experiences acceptance. This I think, is a large share of what constitutes psychotherapy, that the individual finds that the feelings he has been ashamed of or that he has been unable to admit into his awareness, that those can be accepted by another person, so then he becomes able to accept them as a part of himself. I don't know too much of your thinking about interpersonal relationships, but I wonder how that sounds to you.
I believe that you are absolutely right in saying that without the man-to-man experience of forgiveness, or better, acceptance of the unacceptable, is a very necessary precondition for self-affirmation. And you cannot forgive yourself, you cannot accept yourself. If you look in the spiritual mirror, then you are much more prone to hate yourself and to be disgusted with yourself. So I believe that all the forms of confessional in the churches and the confessions between friends and married people, and now the psychoanalytic confession of one's deeper levels, which are opened up by the analyst, that without these things there is no possibility of experiencing something of which, however, I would say it belongs ultimately to another dimension, the dimension of the ultimate, let me call it preliminarily. But I would say, with you, only the right acceptance is the medium through which it is necessary men have to go from man to man before the dimension of the ultimate is possible. And I may add here that I have not used often anymore the word forgiveness, because this often produces a bad superiority in him who forgives and the humiliation of him who is forgiven. Therefore, I prefer the concept of acceptance. And if you accept this acceptance, then I think I can confess that I have learned it from psychoanalysis. I have learned to translate a theological concept which doesn't communicate any longer and replaced it by the way in which the psychoanalyst accepts his patient, not judging him, not telling him you must first be good, otherwise I cannot accept you, but accepting him just because he is not good, but he has something in himself which wants to be good.
Certainly in my own experience, the potency of acceptance of another person has been demonstrated time and time again. When an individual feels that he is both fully accepted in all that he's been able to express and yet prized as a person, this has a very potent influence on his life and on his behavior.
Yes, now I believe that this is really the center of what we call the good news in the Christian message, which has...
You have been listening to two of the modern world's most perceptive minds, Paul Tillich, philosophical theologian, and Carl Rogers, psychologist, in a dialogue of our tongue, produced by Robert Lee and directed by Thomas D. Skinner. This program was presented in cooperation with the Western Behavioral Sciences Institute at La Jolla, California, by Radio Television, San Diego State.
The other being